All right, I think that we are at 11. So I'm going to kick us off and introduce you, Volt, and the day. And I'm so excited to have everyone here. And some people had some fun backstage viewing of us getting set up here. So thanks for bearing with us. But thank you to all of our attendees today for joining us today for Carnegie's digital workshop. And we are really happy to bring this back by popular demand. And we're really excited to provide all the content for you today. And whether you choose to just be at one session or all the sessions today, we are excited for you to be here. Carnegie has been serving the higher education community for close to 40 years, and this just represents one way that we serve you all in the higher ed community with our ongoing thought leadership and education throughout the year. So if you like today's workshop, you can check out other events that we have, webinars, blogs, white papers, other areas that we are serving thought leadership on the Carnegie website in the resources tab, so check it out. Before we get to our first session today, I want to share just a few quick housekeeping items. All sessions today will be recorded. We will be providing the links to all the recordings to all attendees via Whova immediately after the event. And also it will all be available on the Carnegie website in that resource tab that I mentioned, probably at some point next week. For any questions that you have for the speakers, please use the Q&A function, not the chat. And we'll be answering and monitoring those Q&A at the end of the session, time permitting. Finally, if you have any questions or need any support throughout the conference, you can also email marketing@carnegiehighered.com or message our team in the Whova web app, Ask Organizers Anything section of the community board. So with that, I'm really excited to introduce our first session, Digital Storytelling, led by my esteemed colleague here, Voltaire.
Awesome. Thank you, Alexa. And thank you everyone for joining for this opening keynote. Much appreciated. A little bit about me as we get started. My name is Voltaire. Oh, wait, there we go. My name is Voltaire. I'm the EVP for Creative at Carnegie. Prior to joining Carnegie, I was the co-founder and CEO of mStoner for roughly 20 years. We were a web agency serving colleges and universities across the country and around the world. My persona, according to Carnegie's archetype methodology, is the compassionate and charming aficionado. And I'm a CrossFitter, a cook, a photographer. I'm a Francophile trying desperately to learn French in my mid-50s, and I'm a dog dad. Usually you would see the two puppies behind me, but they inherently know when I'm doing a presentation, and they inherently try to hog the screen, so they are quietly resting in another room. So let's get started with today, and I figure that since this is a webinar on storytelling, that I owed you a bit of a story. And in order to do that, I'm going to take you back to, I would say spring of 1986, to a small all-boys high school in the middle of downtown Chicago called Quigley North. And it was the spring of that year, and we had just taken our ACTs, and we were sitting around the lunchroom talking about what people usually do when they start taking standardized tests and prepping for college. We started talking about the future. And so at one point, Tony Brandeis turned to me and he asked, Bolt, what do you think you want to do when you grow up? And so for a moment I paused and I said to Tony, you know what, Tony, I think I want to be a writer. And Tony looked at me with absolutely no irony whatsoever and said, Bolt, writers are a dime a dozen. They make absolutely no money. And if you decide to become a writer, you will be wasting your life. Now, that was within itself, when you hear those words, a little, I don't know, painful. But when you understand the difference between Tony Brandeis and me, it becomes even more poignant. So a little bit about Tony Brandeis. Tony Brandeis was tall, strawberry blonde, piercing blue eyes, broad-shouldered. He played all the sports well. He was the most popular person in the school. And if you had a prom at an all-boys school, which you didn't, then Tony was so popular that he would be elected both prom king and queen. And I, on the other hand, I was short, morbidly obese, Asian. I could not dribble a basketball. I could not throw a football. I could not play hockey. I had absolutely no currency in anything that would make me popular. And the only thing that I was really able to do was I was able to string a full sentence together. So to hear Tony Brandeis tell me that what I was good at and what I loved was something that would lead nowhere was incredibly, it basically shook my world. So I stopped for a second, thought to myself, looked up at his piercingly blue eyes and said the only thing that I could say when confronted with the immovable force that was Tony Brandeis: oh crap, I need to find a new career. Now, fast forward 30 years, I never had a job as a writer, but I wrote every single day of my life, whether it was writing a piece for an alumni magazine or a letter for the annual fund or putting together a report or producing training materials. So even though I was never a writer by title, I always felt like I was a writer by trade. And I would say the same thing for everyone here today. I would bet that no one here has the title storyteller, but every single one of us on this call, on this webinar, is a purveyor of stories. And if what I'm able to do today is inspire you a little bit and help you connect to your inherent ability to tell stories, then I think I will have done my job. So let's talk a little bit about how I want to get there. We've got 5 items on the agenda. First is the power of story. Second is the structure of story. Third is story in the digital age. Fourth is how to mobilize story. And fifth is lessons learned. So let's just get into it. The power of story. Now, if you are going to read one book on storytelling in your life, make it this one. Jonathan Goshall wrote a book called The Storytelling Animal: How Stories Make Us Human. And in it, he says, story teaches us facts about the world. It influences our moral logic and marks us with fears, hopes, and anxieties that alter our behavior, perhaps even our personalities. So I think most of us, when we think about story, we connect with story as a means for entertainment. And if that is all that story does, if all that story serves in our lives is to entertain us and take us away from the present moment for a little bit, then I don't know about you, but that for me is absolutely more than enough. But story actually serves 7 more purposes in our lives. The second purpose that story serves is it helps us to solve problems. It's often through reading or hearing stories of other people who solve problems that we find the strength and insight to solve our own. I don't know how many of you have lived in Chicago for any amount of time, but I've been in Chicago for a little more than or a little less than 55 years now. And so I grew up watching Oprah. And those of us who know Oprah knows at a certain point when she had lost weight, maybe the second or third time, she decided to auction off all of her clothing. And I remember this one woman calling in after that auction. And she said, you know, I bought a pair of your shoes, Oprah. Now, this woman didn't have a lot of money. She seemed like she was basically living hand to mouth, struggling a lot. But she bought a pair of shoes in the auction that weren't even her size. And she was saying to Oprah on the call, Oprah, you know, when things get really bad, I pull those shoes out. I pull your shoes out and I put my feet in them for a while. Because I think to myself, if Oprah was able to overcome everything that she overcame, from sexual abuse to prejudice, to being a woman, a Black woman in the industry back in the 70s and the 80s, if you could overcome all that and be successful, then so can I. I really love that story that woman shared. Third purpose that story serves in our lives is to help us to assimilate. Stories help us to adapt to new situations more easily. The fourth purpose is that stories help us to impart tradition. They help us to pass on values, ritual, and meaning from one generation to another. Stories help us to teach. Now, those of you who've been to business school know exactly what this is like, because all of business school seems to be those HBR 2-page case studies. When I was going through business school, that was pretty much the bulk of our curriculum. We would get a 2-page abstract of an actual company, and we would find out what the situation was in front of that company, who the decision makers were. They would lay out all the facts. They would ask us, what decision would you make? And then they would tell us the backstory, and they would tell us what would happen. The sixth purpose of story is to provide pattern and order. Now, I had a leadership coach who said to me once, Volt, In the face of the lack of information, our minds will run to the worst possible conclusions. Let me pause there for just a second and have you think about that. In the face of the lack of information, our minds will run to the worst possible conclusions. And I'm not going to ask anyone to out themselves in the chat, but if I could get a quiet amen from people who know and have lived this, that would be awesome. We are structured to find pattern and order. And when no pattern and order are readily available, we will construct a narrative in our own minds in order to help us to understand what is happening. The seventh purpose of story is to connect. Stories help us to understand similarities and accept differences between people, communities, countries, and cultures. And then finally, stories help us to define. And when I say define, I mean they help us to define ourselves, both for ourselves and for other people. Now, speaking of HBR, I got this really great tip of the day from HBR several weeks ago, talking about moving from territorial to collaborative leadership. And one of the pieces of advice that they give is start by deconstructing why you feel the need to be competitive or territorial. What story are you telling yourself about your colleagues and your organization? Once you understand the assumptions underlying your behavior, you can challenge and change them. So stories are very much a way for us to understand ourselves and to portray ourselves to the wider world. So I want to share this quote from Paul Zak with you. A compelling story with an emotional trigger alters our brain chemistry. It makes us more trusting, understanding, and open to ideas. Now, that's really, really awesome, right? I mean, it's a great quote. Someone tell me in the chat what they think neuroeconomics is. Neuroeconomics. Anyone? Anyone? There are no wrong answers, only unfortunate ones. So someone chat me. Someone chat me. Anyone? Efficiency of thought. Thank you, Brendan. Awesome. Anyone else? How the brain processes decision-making. Priyanka, that's great. Brain currency, brain power. Those all touch in a way. Yes, economics based on psychology, decision-making based on values. Yes. Neuroeconomics is the study. It is basically a cross-disciplinary study of neurology and psychology and economics and how they come together and how all of those drive decision-makings. Paul Zak basically has dedicated his career to understanding how story can influence economics, both at the individual level of how people buy and at the global level of how storytelling can actually shift economies. So when you think about someone who's dedicated their career to doing something like that, you realize that story is not just for entertainment. Story touches us at the neurological level, at the psychological level, most importantly, at the emotional level. And that's what makes story as powerful as it is. So we've talked a little bit about the power of story. Now let's talk about the structure of story. And we're going to play a game. All right. This is we're playing for glory. There are no prizes here, but we're going to play Guess the Story. Here's the first one, and type this into the chat as soon as you know it. Once upon a time, a young war veteran takes a job as a salesman and rents a small house. One day, he's invited to a party by his next door neighbor. Because of that, the neighbors become friends. Because of that, he becomes entwined in the messy relationships that rule the neighbor's circle of friends, frenemies, and lovers, until finally multiple people die meaningless death and the war veteran flees to the kinder, gentler Midwest. Yes, The Great Gatsby. Johanna, you got it first. That's awesome. Thank you. All right. Let's play that game a second time. Once upon a time, a man created a theme park inhabited by an android host. The androids were programmed with the inability to harm humans, giving guests the chance to indulge in their wildest and darkest fantasies. One day, without fear of repercussion, one day a software update allows an android to access memories that should have been long deleted. Because of that, she awakens to her true nature and the nature of the park itself. Because of that, she undertakes a quest to transform herself until finally a bloody showdown of epic proportions occurs. And yes, 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 that is Westworld. Thank you, Julie. Awesome. Oh, he did. Oh, awesome. Thank you, Teresa. All right, let's do one more. Once upon a time, there was a young woman in love. One day she found out her boyfriend was a player. Because of that, she decided to take reprisal while he was having fun at a local bar. Because of that, she reduced his most prized possession to a useless immobile pile of leather, glass, and steel, until finally, having satiated her rage, she congratulated herself on paying it forward and resolved to date higher quality men. Yes, yes, Carrie and Lisa, or Victoria and Lisa. Yes, Carrie Underwood before he cheats. Simone, that's awesome. Carrie Underwood lives forever. So the reason that I showed all of these examples to you, these three examples, is because frankly, it doesn't really matter whether we're talking about the great American novel or a highly funded, highly produced sci-fi series or a country western song. All stories follow a similar pattern. Now, what's that pattern? Aristotle talks about it this way, talks about exposition, complication, crisis, climax, and resolution. I like Pixar's version just a little bit better. Once upon a time, one day, because of that, until finally. Let's take that apart just a little bit. Once upon a time, the first part of the story, it's where you get the setting, the time, the place, the characters, and at times the backstory. And it's when the theme and the plot begin to emerge. Great example of that is Will and Katie, basically parking cars and singing karaoke together before he finds out the legend of the rings. The second part of the story is complication. This is where it gets fun, right? One day, this is where everything changes. Want plus obstacle equals conflict. A good example of that, Big dies. That leads to the third part of the story, crisis, because of that. It's here where we see the progression of the theme and plot, and you see this good, this bad, this rinse repeat, where people feel like they're moving forward, and then they have setbacks, and then forward again, have more setbacks, and the tension of the story builds because of those setbacks. A great example of that is Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz. All she wanted to do was keep Toto safe. Suddenly, she's in a cyclone and she lands her house. Actually, the house landed for her on the Wicked Witch of the East, right? And then she meets Glinda. Now, just want to pause here for a second and talk a little bit about Glinda. Like when I first saw The Wizard of Oz, I thought, oh, this is so helpful. The good fairy's floating in on a bubble and she's going to make everything better. But I think Gregory Maguire actually got it right in Wicked. I think that Glinda is actually the original mean girl. I mean, when you think about it for a second, here she is, she floats in on a bubble after Dorothy has inadvertently killed a witch. And then she put heels on Dorothy. Can you imagine a girl from Kansas who's never been in heels before, now stuck in ruby slippers? And then she says, oh, and you can't take them off. Oh, and I can't help you pass the borders of this land. So you're going to have to walk on a yellow brick road for miles and miles in heels. Good luck. Not a very, very helpful person, Glinda, as far as I'm concerned. And that's where the tension builds, right? She goes on a quest, exactly, the hero quest begins. She meets her friends, the Cowardly Lion, the Scarecrow, the Tin Man. She almost dies in a field of poison poppies. She gets a sort of charge from the Wizard of Oz to bring back the broom. And then there are the flying monkeys, right? So this is a great example of tension building in the story through that good and bad and rinse repeat. The fourth part of the story is climax because of that, the big crescendo. And I would say that there is no better example of that than Luke Skywalker finding out that Darth Vader is his father. And that leads finally to the end, the resolution, until finally. Realization and transformation, conclusion, and lesson. One of my favorite examples of that is Slumdog Millionaire. I don't know how many of you have seen this. This was released in 2008. It's a story about an orphan on the streets of India who ends up on a game show, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. and he miraculously makes it to the last round. And Prem, the host, asks him a question. In the Alexandre Dumas book, The Three Musketeers, two of the musketeers are called Porthos and Athos. What is the name of the third musketeer? And you see these sort of flashbacks because Jamal, the main character, has carried the Three Musketeers around as book for many years, and the punchline is he's never read it. And so I'm not going to spoil this for you by letting you know what happens, but it's a great example of conclusion. So we've talked now about why story is powerful. We've talked about what sort of structure story has. Let's talk about story in the digital age and how things have changed, or maybe how they haven't changed since we got from Aristotle to now. Frank Rose, in his book, The Art of Immersion, has this great quote: stories themselves are universal, but the way we tell them changes with the technology at hand. Every new medium has given rise to a new form of narrative, and people want to be immersed. Here's a really fun fact as well that I love. We process visuals 60,000 times faster than text. Further, human brains decipher image elements simultaneously, while language is decoded in a linear sequential manner, taking more time to process. So what is the big difference that we are seeing now that we're in the digital age? Is the fact that we can create these stories that are highly immersive and that are even more powerful, because in addition to the written word, you can actually layer on images, audio, video in a way that tells the story more compellingly and more immersively than you could if you were just reading a book, at least philosophically. So what does story look like? Here's one example. This is the University of Washington. They have an incredible story bank for their Boundless campaign. This particular story was about a set of research across University of Washington who came together to help this poor girl who was suffering from seizures from the time that she was born to actually heal, feel, and move again. So the story starts with this picture and a brief explanation of what this story is about. It layers on a video that talks about Jaina, and it starts with her mother telling about the scary first instance where Jaina had a seizure and she realized that her life would never be the same. As you work through the story, you see, this is not animated, but you see animated infographics and quotes. You see these mini profiles of the researchers who were part of the team to help Jaina. You see these infographics that explain somewhat complex procedures and concepts in hopefully an easier to digest sort of way. And then at the end of it, you see this call or the set of calls to action: give now, connect, sign up for our newsletter. So on one side of the spectrum, you've got this really incredible long form layered digital storytelling. And you see a lot of this, for instance, on the New York Times and the Washington Post. Boston University does a great job with this. And on the other side of the spectrum, you see stories like this. This is what I would consider like a micro story. This is from Faces of, or Humans of St. Louis, or Humans of Washington University at St. Louis. This is a campaign that Cassandra Harris, I believe, or no, Sigarin runs. And this is a story about Douglas Flo, one of faculty members. Here is basically a really great photograph and a few paragraphs that talk about his background. Also could be as simple as a quote. This is Douglas Flo talking about when he was 11 or 12 reading Langston Hughes' biographical work. And a story can also look like this: a small digital ad with one sentence, a picture, and a call to action. Own your new. Choose your new direction. Find out how. Learn more. So I want to point out what I think are the four main facets of digital storytelling. The first is this idea of interactivity and immersion. Really great digital storytelling uses engaging design, high contrast, high saturated, high impact photography, video, audio, illustrations, infographics, and data visualization, and layers them all together to allow people to explore and learn a number of things in bite-sized pieces. So the first facet of digital storytelling is this interactivity and this full immersion that you get. The second facet is what I call methodical, there we go. I always stumble on that. Methodical maximization. The idea first that we have atomic units of information, or what I call micro stories. Now, I got my start in print. I did alumni magazines back in the early 90s. And I remember that it was a really good day when we sent the final files off to the printer, because we realized at that point there was nothing that we could do, right? And we were relieved that the story was over, or the work was over. The story and the work for digital storytelling begins once the story is published. And instead of telling these 500,000 word long form stories through written word, now what we have are these micro stories that could be quotes, that could be captioned photographs, that could be a 30-second video. They can stand on their own, but then you can bring them together. They can ladder up to a larger narrative. We also have the ability to use metadata and keyword planning to support search engine optimization. We can tag our stories so that people can explore and build taxonomies to bring order to the bank of stories that we're telling. We have cloud-based collaboration tools that can bring multiple departments together to work on stories in real time. And we have content management tools that can deploy those stories across web, digital, social, email, and still the printed word. The third facet of storytelling, digital storytelling, is this idea of inspiration to action. I remember when we were, again, going back to my alumni, my print days, I remember we would be thrilled when we'd get a note from someone saying, oh, I really loved that article that you wrote. And that was usually the only way that we could gauge some level of success or engagement from people, was people giving us feedback. But in digital storytelling, we can embed calls to action. We can allow people to amplify the story through likes and shares. We can allow them to comment and contribute. We can actually gift content now. If you've been on the New York Times site recently, you can basically send articles to friends or colleagues for $2.99. You can explore related stories. You can create follow-on experiences, those dive deeper moments through podcasts and playlists. And the final facet of digital story that makes it so powerful is this idea of measurement and optimization. So we have frameworks so that we can measure and refine how well stories are doing, how long people looked at a video, how far down they scrolled on a page, how many things did they click on in an email. All of this stuff is so easily measured now. Experimentation capability, A/B and multivariate testing, and now the advent of artificial intelligence tools to help us not only with that measurement and optimization, but in certain cases in the segmentation and the development of content itself. So we've talked about the power of story, the structure of story, how story is different and more immersive in the digital age. Let's talk about mobilizing story. So based on everything that we have talked about, put together 2 checklists for you. And these checklists are really founded in this idea of empathy. This is a quote from Indy Young, one of the pioneers of user experience design. She says that empathy is about understanding what's going on in a person's head and heart, and acknowledging their reasoning and emotions is valid, even when they differ from your own. So I would wager that good storytelling begins from a foundation of empathy, with our wanting to understand our audiences in an effort to connect with them in some meaningful way. And in order to do that, you have to ask some questions. Who am I producing this story for? Why is this story important for them? What do I want them to understand or learn as a result of the story? What do I want them to actually do? And this is my favorite one. What story do I want them to be able to tell about themselves? We're going to come back to that idea in just a second. The second set of questions that I would wager you should ask is, how do you create a sustainable model for storytelling? How will you measure success? How can you bring a story to life with the resources that you have access to? And how can you approach stories in a way that will extend your capabilities over time? That brings us to the final segment in today's keynote, which is this idea of lessons learned. And in order to do that, we are going to take a poll. And the question is this: who's the hero in Back to the Future? We have a few choices here, 4 to be exact. Got Marty, George, the father, Lorraine, the mother, or Doc. All right, poll has been launched. Yes, Alexa?
My big moment is now. I'm
All
watching
right,
the live
everyone.
answers. We only have so far 10 folks, so keep going in. Put it in, if you could, into the Whova polls chat. You have a lot of love happening in the
I
Slack
know, this is
or
great.
the Zoom chat. So we only have 10 that are actually in the live poll in Whova, with Marty taking the lead.
Okay. All right, so Marty is taking the lead. Who's next, Alexa?
You have George. No, sorry, Lorraine.
Okay.
So you have Marty, Lorraine, and then you have George and Doc tied, but the poll has been stagnant because the but that's where you are.
All
Those are
right. All right. Well, you know, y'all, who never gets called out as the hero of the story? The high school. So here's the lesson 1 that I want to impart to you all. Your institution is not the hero of the story. The institution is not the hero of the story. Andrew Stanton, the filmmaker for Toy Story, says the greatest story commandment is make me care. Now, I told you that we would come back to this idea of what story do you want people to be able to tell about themselves? This is one of the things I love about digital storytelling, is that in a small span, you can actually invoke a story in people's minds. This is an example of digital ad. Do more of what you love. More College of Art and Design, apply now. The world needs more of you, apply now. We're not talking about a lot of words. You get a little bit of a sense of the playfulness of the institution, the sense of inclusivity that the institution has. The colors are bright and vibrant and optimistic. But the real heart of the story is what people who see this begin to tell themselves. Because the call to action here, or the challenge, do what you love, or the world needs more of you, it basically puts your audience at the heart of the story and helps them to imagine the sort of story that they want to tell about themselves based on what they might accomplish at the Moore College of Art and Design. I love the fact that we're able to do that in such a small, constrained space. Lesson number 2. No conflict, no story. Bill Stratham says, conflict is a story's oxygen. Now you might say to yourself, well, you know, we're talking about a really small space in some cases. We're talking about like less than 25 words. How are you supposed to create a story and find conflict in that little space, in that little time? I would wager that it's possible. For sale, baby shoes never worn. This was highly attributed to Hemingway. Spoiler alert, he didn't actually write it, but this is a great example of what people call flash fiction. And what's really interesting about it, right, Dave? It's the saddest story ever. And what makes it sad are the details that we fill in, right? Because what we imagine immediately is tragedy. And we begin to imagine what might have happened to the baby, what might have happened to the parents, why they're selling the shoes. Now, if you parse this for a little bit longer, you could probably come up with 3 or 4 narratives that are slightly happier, that reinterpret the story. But the fact is that what a story in this small space does is it calls to us to fill in the details and makes us active participants in the story generation itself. Third lesson, fewer stories, better told. What matters is really telling a true story well. As professional communicators, I think we sometimes feel the crush of people wanting more stories, more profiles, more content. And I would say that rather than generating a large body of content, that if we take more time to craft stories more mindfully, that those fewer stories will do better and more efficient and effective work for us as marketers, as communication professionals, as relationship builders. Lesson 4, story first, department second. This is, I've got 2 quotes to share with you here. The Rockefeller Center talks about the fact that they found time and time again, the most effective organizations had a storytelling culture where everyone was on the same page about how to tell a story. And this great quote from the New York Times Innovation Report: a significant amount of distrust and skepticism stems from speaking slightly different languages. People are referring to the same thing when one side says content or brand and the other side says journalism. Anyone who's worked with faculty can probably understand this tension really, really well. And a lot of times when I work with institutions, they say, we just don't have the resources to tell stories. And what they're really saying is, I don't have those resources on my team. And so one of the things that storytelling can do is help break down those silos, because believe it or not, the same stories that are going to work for prospective students and their families, with a little bit of tweaking, are going to be great stories to tell your current students, great stories to tell your alumni and your prospective faculty, stories to share with funding foundations or corporate partners. So once we realize that the stories that we want to tell can touch multiple audiences in multiple ways, that hopefully is a call for us to learn how to collaborate. And that brings us to the final lesson, which basically comes from me. The best stories we tell are the stories we learn to tell together. Thank you. All right, Alexa, I'm turning this back to you for chat and questions.
Thank you. I don't see any questions. There's a lot of love in the Whova chat, so check that out afterwards as well, Volt. I know you were looking at the Zoom chat, but there was a whole bunch of chatter going on within the Whova interface.
Awesome.
I don't see any questions posted in the Q&A, which then thank you for a fantastic session. You've given us so much to think about in terms of telling better stories and connecting. And then I'm just going to close this out with a couple of housekeeping. All of these sessions today will be recorded. We are really sorry for there was some interruption at the beginning of this presentation. We had some technical difficulties that we sorted out. So for anybody who came on late, we apologize for that. Some of the housekeeping moments earlier in the session, all sessions will be recorded. We hope that you will attend live, but if not, you can get them either in the Whova interface or they will all be posted to the Carnegie website in about a week's time. Next up on our agenda, starting at noon Eastern time, is Mastering Social Media Marketing Strategies, Channels, and Campaign Excellence, which will get started in about 20 minutes from here. Again, if you need any help throughout the conference, please email marketing@Carnegie Higher Ed or message us through the Ask Organizers Anything section of the community board. We are very grateful for all of you joining. We are very grateful for you, Volt, and your compelling session. And we will see you all here in about 20 minutes. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Take care.